It is so warm out now. Finally again, it is March, and it is supposed to get to 74 degrees in Albany, New York today. That is awesome. So here I am, wearing short sleeves. The weather just makes me happier. So, a quick update to my channel. I am making a commitment to upload 2 times every week. So I was faced with, what should I make a video about today? I wasn't feeling much inspiration. I was thinking about things non-religious, about the weather, about spring training starting, about my ultimate frisbee trip that I will be going on this weekend. But I'm trying to stick to a religious channel theme, so I wasn't sure exactly what to do. So, I'm a religious studies major though, so I looked in my notes and thought about suffering. I can kind of relate to that over the past couple weeks, and so yeah, I'll talk about suffering today, and let's go with the intro. So, suffering is a very diverse, or a debated topic among theologians today. The Orthodox view. Well, first, before we get to the Orthodox view, what are the traits of God? When most people think about the attributes that God has, they come out with traits such as being perfect, being eternal, being unchanging. A vocabulary word for unchanging is immutable or infallible, that is unable to make any mistakes, unfalsifiable. Being a creator, also being forgiving, being omnipotent or all-knowing, being powerful and loving and merciful and gracious, and also there's 2 interesting traits that my religious studies class came up with, which is jealous, mostly in the Old Testament it seems, and maternal. I do agree with maternal a lot more. And we can all agree that being a mother or a parent can induce some suffering. So if God is maternal, can he have suffering? Well, can you be perfect and still suffer? That's what the argument is. So the Orthodox view, I'm going to read what I had in my notes a little bit. So the Bible stated that a God should feel for another through compassion and also be present in love. It implies that God suffers right alongside his people when they suffer, okay? So the Greek philosophy does not agree with that. It insists that God cannot suffer because there was an ideal of immutable perfection beyond the world, and suffering cannot be part of this perfection. So they say suffering and perfection cannot coexist. Suffering because a beloved suffers, however, is part of how love and compassion should be, which is how many theologians see it, and the theory that I agree with. So, one theologian by the name of Jürgen Moltmann agrees that God can indeed suffer out of this compassionate idea of love, the compassionate love. So out of love for his people, he says that God can suffer, that it is part of compassionate love. God chooses to suffer, however. This is the distinction. Suffering is not an imperfection. God freely makes the decision to suffer. So it is not that he is incapable of suffering. So Elizabeth Johnson, in her book Consider Jesus, which is where this information came out of, writes of Moltmann's argument that God suffers not out of a deficiency of weakness in the divine nature, but out of the fullness of love. God is only love because he can suffer in this way. For it is out of the essence of love to be affected by what is happening to the one you love and to suffer or rejoice as a result. So you can say that God allows suffering and does not cause suffering. You can say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, so suffering is good. And even God suffers and gets stronger by it. But then it also leads into the conflict with immutability, which is unchangeability. And if you get better through suffering, this also says that God can change for the good or for the bad. My personal opinion, I do agree that God can change for the better, and that it is fitting to change with the times. Moltmann's perspective is based off of an unchanging desire of God to be close to the people, but Moltmann might say that God is unchanging in some respects, but not necessarily others. You can improve in certain things, like how scientists improve when they learn new information and how their perspective changes. It's kind of like God in a way. It's hard to explain. But dealing with the question of suffering, Johnson actually agrees with Hugo Moltmann that God suffers out of love for his people and that he chooses to suffer. There's another theologian, Edward Schillebeeckx, who also considers whether God suffers, and he does not agree with Moltmann at all. He has the opposite point of view. He does not agree that God can suffer. He argues that evil exists and occurs, but that God offers hope in spite of all evil, overcoming suffering with joy. So God offers hope in spite of all evil. He will overcome all evil and transform that suffering into joy. Johnson writes, from his point of view, we are saved not by the cross, but despite the cross. I definitely heard of from suffering comes joy, suffering is turned to joy. In one of my sermons, I said shared joy is double joy, shared sorrow is half sorrow. There's a lot of different sayings that relate to suffering and joy, and how suffering leads to joy. But suffering can also lead to joy in hope also through the knowledge that God, or any divinity for that matter, loves us and suffers with us because he chooses to do so. Now, why would God allow suffering? We've determined that God does not cause suffering or does not suffer from his own free will, because that may be a indirect conflict with the perfect qualities of a divine character. But why does God allow it if he is omnipotent or all-knowing and knows what is going to happen? I had a really good argument for this in class today, and I am forgetting exactly what I said. For now, I'm going to say that God allows suffering because he knows everything that is to come. He knows how we will build from suffering. So here, I've had periods in my life where I have suffered, but I get to learn from it, develop from it, use it in sermons to help other people down the road, and things like that. You basically build from the suffering in some way. So, yeah, that's basically it. It's a difficult concept, but God can exist while there is still suffering and evil on the earth. Why is there evil? Because God wants to give people hope in spite of it. Why did people suffer in the Old Testament? Because God had a plan all along for Jesus to be the one to save all people from their sins. God will not change his plan, because Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you hope. I should have the verse in front of me, but Jeremiah 29:11, plans to give you prosperous health and plans not to harm you, things like that. So look at Jeremiah 29:11. That it summarizes the idea of God having plans for us, and that those plans might involve suffering in order to reach what those plans are. So God has an ultimate goal for us. God has a hidden talent in each of us that we will develop, and why we are put here on earth. You are put here on earth for a reason. My faith tells me that. Personally, I prefer Moltmann's view concerning whether God suffers, because it focuses less on power and more on divine love. And God is not as much about power, even though he is all-powerful. God wants to portray the humble quality of love rather than the non-humble quality of power, because that's who God is. He's a loving and merciful over a powerful up here God that he wants you to look up to. He actually, through a process called divine kenosis, he actually devalues himself so that humans can look to be more like him. So divine kenosis, God self-empties his divine glories. His divinity was not a valuable attribute to seek to attain. The text in Johnson stated that one can become more like God the more human he or she is. Therefore, in presenting himself, God presenting himself in human form as Jesus, he presented himself in the form of a servant in the manner that all Christians should seek to be. It is an imperfection of faith if we seek to be divine. So we should seek to be Christ-like, and that is why we had the incarnation in Jesus. It was part of God's plan to save all people from their sin, inspiring to be up here and powerful and thinking that they're so good because they're so Christian. So that's my spiel against power and why God should not be seen as powerful, and why I do not support Skilleback's view of focusing on power more than love, and God's power to overcome the suffering with joy in spite of all evil, in spite of everything. In other words, in spite of the cross and not by the cross. I feel like I'm in a close relationship with God in Christ through Moltmann's perspective of divine suffering, because it bases everything off of that humble quality of love. So God is with us in suffering, and he is there whenever we need him to make sure that we do not suffer alone, and that he is always that hope promising you of something better. So yes, suffering is required to give us hope, because without suffering everything would be joyous anyway, and then be nothing better to hope for. And I think that just destroys our faith. So yes, suffering has to exist in the world, and that's why God doesn't use his power to totally eliminate it. He allows it, and it also shows his love and himself, and shows his divine kenosis. It shows himself emptying himself, suffering on the cross, by the cross, to show us how he loves us. God bless you all. And remember, next time you're suffering, remember the hope that is there for you from a religious perspective from my religious channel. So God bless you.